Hello and welcome to the World Changemaker podcast, where we have engaging conversations with everyone from entrepreneurs to advocates. I'm your host, Cinnamon Alvarez. Be ready to get inspired because our guest today is going to share their story, insights, and golden nuggets with us about how they're making a meaningful difference in people's lives and in our communities. If you like what you hear today, subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. And while you're there, leave us a review. Hello and welcome to the World Changemaker podcast. I am your host, Cinnamon Alvarez, co-founder of World Changemaker, and I am here today with Super Heumann, who is going to share some stories and tips and advice to help raise your impact in the world. So, Stephen, I know that you're a storyteller, a director, a writer, a ghostwriter, but tell us a little bit, if you don't mind introducing yourself, and tell us a little bit about how you make an impact to the clients that you serve. What do you like to do?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me on the podcast.
Yeah.
I really appreciate it. So a little bit about me. I grew up in Southern California, and I was, I was in a big family, and we moved up into Utah when I was a teenager, and I was always a storyteller. I was always, a writer and wanted to kind of pursue that. But my family was very much you don't follow your dreams because that's crazy. You put your head down and you get a job and you do your thing. And so I tried to do that for a really long time. Just get a job. And luckily I got a job in television as a writer and director. And so I eventually was running an entire production company, doing kind of whatever I wanted. I was kind of an entrepreneur without having to be an entrepreneur. I could make the decisions that I wanted to. It was quite wonderful. And I was able to travel all over the world and do wonderful adventures, outdoor adventures and things like that. Because one of our primary shows was an outdoor adventure show. And so if we were going somewhere cool, I could make the choice to go there and work with the talent and do all that stuff and do the adventures. But about 5.5 years ago, I realized that I needed to do something different. I needed to take control, and I needed to do what I really felt that I was called to do. And so when I stepped away from television, it was a scary time because I didn't grow up in a family that was like, hey, go and risk everything,
Go be an entrepreneur and have no stability.
Yeah, right. And it wasn't just me. Like I'm married and I have 6 children. So it was like, this wasn't just a sort of like, well, I'll give it a try. It was like, okay, we're all in. My wife was like, okay, let's do this. And so we started Super Heumann Creative. And what I wanted to do was focus on what I loved and what I loved about television, because I never enjoyed the commercial side, like the actual making of the commercials. Because I always felt there was kind of a fakeness there. No matter how good the commercial is, if you've got actors, it's fake. They're pretending to be something. I really enjoyed sitting down with individuals and helping them to tell their stories, because we did a lot of that where it would just be documentary and interview based, and allowing someone to just in the moment talk about their stories and how they got to where they were and what they learned and that sort of stuff. And then editing it together so that it was a beautiful piece. And I just loved that. I absolutely loved it. And as a writer myself, I was like, well, I want to write my own story. So when we started Super Heumann Creative, I was like, I'll be a novelist. And so I own a publishing company, and I was like, I'll write my own novels and go through that whole process, which is a whole other thing. And then I'll do stuff and help other people to tell their stories. And I can do it in video because obviously I worked in TV, and I can do it in ghostwritten books as well because I know how to do all that. So, I'm a writer, I'm an author, I'm a published author. So it's like, okay, so I know about pacing and I know about all of that sort of stuff. And so I've been able to help individuals to really take pride in their stories. I think that's one of the things that I've noticed is that most people undervalue their own stories, which is sad because our stories are amazing. Like I truly believe that our stories are what make us, they're what make the world, because we don't like have an emotional connection to facts and figures, but we have an emotional connection to people and to what they've been through. And when we can take pride in our stories and feel good about how they're being told, man, that changes the world. And it's so fun to be able to sit down with people and help them to understand that, and then have me be the medium that story passes through. So that's what's been so wonderful about this kind of part of my journey.
So I have so many questions, and thank you for the work you do, because I have to tell you that one of my biggest fears, I'm a published author also, but I hate to write. It's absolutely terrifying. Um, in so many ways. And I know that you're superhuman, but I just think it's so valuable for people, for our listeners to really get that we all need help. And that's what I mentioned to you before we even connected, that one of the things I love about business is this is how we contribute, how we make a difference, and how we, see positive change in the world. So what is something that actually you're afraid of? Because it seems like everything comes easy for you.
That's it. I put on that. I put on a good front, don't I?
Right, right. That's why
Um,
I want you to be not so superhuman for our
yeah.
listener, because you can help them tell their story. But what kind of things do you have fear of, or do you have any tricks or life hacks of where you ask for help and you receive help?
So I have all of the same. So for all the entrepreneurs out there,
Hmm.
the entrepreneurial journey is one of ups and downs, right? You're one minute you're swimming with the sharks and just loving every second, and the next you're down because business has dropped, and you're like, okay, well now we got to pull from our savings, um, and so for me, that's always been a fear of mine that I've had to overcome is just understand that cycle and be like, okay, everything's going to work out because it always has. We've always made it work. And so I don't need to give into that fear. But that's always the one is just that what what are things looking like in 6 months? And then making it so that my brain isn't 6 months in the future, making it so that my brain is now because I can control now. I can't control 6 months
Yeah.
in the future.
Oh my gosh, it's so
Um,
valuable for our listener. I just want to kind of repeat some of what you said, because I've been in business more than 25 years, and that's exactly it. In fact, I've even been my house got broken into.
oh
And
goodness.
yeah, and this is a few years back, but what was so valuable from that lesson is I remember standing in that present moment and I physically touched myself and I said, I know that financially this is a hit, but I'm okay. So what you just said about being in the, because it's turbulent, and through
Mhm.
experience, you're probably not going to die, even though it feels like you're going to die. So what else do you do to stay grounded in the present moment or to inspire you to propel? Like, do you have any life hacks that you could share with us?
Really, it comes down to when I find myself worrying about the future. So let's say there's so often where you're in a really great place where you're like, okay, well, we've got clients lined up and the money's in and everything's good. And then when you're in that moment, suddenly you jump ahead. Well, now what happens when all of that money's gone? Well, what happens when there's nothing? Oh my gosh, what happens if we lose our house? What you get into that state. And when I find myself doing and feeling that anxiety in my stomach,
Yep.
I really have to pull myself back and almost meditate for a moment and say, okay, I am okay. I'm right here. Things in this moment are just fine. I don't need to worry about that future. That future will come one way or another. And as long as I'm doing what I know I should be doing, like creating connections and being kind to people and doing all that stuff,
Mm.
then things will work themselves out. But it's a constant struggle. Like, it's not something that goes away where you're all of a sudden like, oh, I don't worry about it anymore. It's a constant sort of cycle of just like, okay, I've got to pull back in the moment. And I find it that when I'm in those really good times, that's actually when it's worse. When things are starting to
Hmm.
go bad, I'm usually very calm and be like, nope, everything's going to work out. I'm okay. It's when things are good that I start jumping ahead to that future and I really start getting anxious. And so I have to pull myself back
Oh,
and
you're
say,
giving our
I'm
listeners
good.
gold. Yeah. If you're on the magic carpet ride, caution, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
from experience, I've been there. Oh, that's so great. So, yeah, so some of the things you're talking about, like you've heard about mental renovations, I call them, or turnarounds or things, just being in the present. And as I think that a lot of people they'll see that anxiety and then they'll tell themselves not to. So what I heard you saying is that you meditate on it and embrace it. And that's something that I have learned. Do you agree, like lean into some of those fears?
I think you have to because the fears are real. Like we all have when you've just got a job and you're not worried about paychecks.
Mhm.
That's really just a mental game because you could get fired, your company could go out of business. You don't have any control over over tomorrow any more than anybody else. But you don't have that fear because it's kind of like, well, I'm going to get paid and everything's going to be fine. When you're in this cycle, it's like, well, no, you're in control of all that stuff. But you have to look at that and say, okay, yes, that fear is real and I understand it, but I'm not going to be a slave to it, particularly right now. I can think about it another time and I can make plans to how I can avoid that possibly negative future, but I'm not going to allow it to take me over. And so you've got to respect it, and you got to respect that it is real and that it is fear, and um, but you just can't allow it to affect your decisions right now. You have to say, okay, now is where I am, and now is decisions I have to make. And some of the stuff I'm worried about are decisions that I can't make for 3 or 4 months. And so why am I dedicating brain space to it? And then just
So,
kind of cutting that out.
so
That's how
speaking
I
of,
manage.
yeah, thank you. Sorry to interrupt you. So speaking of making the decision, right? Like when I feel like sometimes people will stay stagnant for a long time because they think that the action is ginormous. What are some of the small, easy steps that it's easy to create some momentum again?
Oh, you've
Like,
really got to just break things down, and you have to say, okay, what is your next step? So here's a great example just from this year.
yeah.
At the beginning of this year, we've had a goal for a long time. We wanted to get a bigger house because my oldest son is currently living in New Zealand, and at the end of this year, he's going to come back. And his space has been taken over by his youngest brother, who, when he left, was much smaller. And so we really don't have a place for him, and we don't want to, when he gets back and it'd be like, oh, well, you can't stay here. So we wanted to get a larger house. But the idea of a larger house, that's a big deal. So it's like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? That's a really big deal. And all it came down to was saying, okay, well, what is the very next step that I can do? And it's
Mm.
like, well, I can contact my realtor, my friend realtor, and I can contact my finance guy. So let's see where we're even at. Those two decisions then set in motion everything else. And so at this point, our bathrooms are being remodeled. We're selling the house next month. Um, but if I hadn't just made that very first decision, then nothing would have happened. And it was because I made that decision that everything else happened. I didn't even have to do anything. Suddenly it was like, oh, all these decisions are coming
Build
up
momentum.
and you're
So
able to do it. And so even in business, it's the same way. What is the very next thing that I can do? Just a small thing. Um, and then you'll find that oftentimes by making that one decision, everything starts to fall in place and it becomes way easier.
that's amazing because that's exactly what I do. And I was wondering because you are a writer, so you don't so if I take it back to right, like writing the book is in your business life, you don't necessarily have to have the full outline perfectly written. What you're saying is you have your eye on ball. This is how I do it, is what is the ideal outcome that I want to see, and what's anything that I can do to get me one step closer to that, and I start taking those actions, and that builds the momentum and some of that confidence, and that's my magic trick. And so that I couldn't believe that you said that. I thought you were going to say that you actually plan it out like an outline.
Well, I think with life, you
Because
can't do that.
that's a
Like you can
skill.
have
That's
your
a different
end
skill.
goal.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So you can say, well, okay, the end goal is the house. Okay. And with
Mm-hmm.
books, so how I do it, whether it's for myself and
Yeah. How do you do it
my
for a
novels,
book?
yeah, or for an individual, I'll go ahead and I'll say, okay, here's the plan more or less. And I'll go through chapter by chapter and say, okay, this is the plan.
Mm-hmm.
Then I also know that during the process, things are going to change dramatically because I have to be in the moment. And so when you're in the moment, you say, okay, what's the next decision? Well, that decision that's 100% right in that moment might derail what you had for that plan. And you just have to be ready and willing to say, okay, that is okay. Because right now, that's the decision that needs to be made. That's the plot point, or that's the history moment from that person's story. And it's going to derail what we had. But I have that overarching where it's like, here's this sort of end game that we want. So it's kind of a mixture, at least in the writing world, it's kind of a mixture of plan and spontaneity
With
of
a
being,
little flexibility.
yeah, of being able to say, I need to adapt. And as long as I can adapt, what's going to end is going to be where it needs to end. But I'm not going to be locked into, well, no, this is exactly how it is. Because I think if you become too sort of stringent on that and you nail in everything saying this is exactly how it's going to go, well, then you really don't set yourself up for success because that's not how life works. Life is more like a river and you need to flow with it sometimes as opposed to telling the river where to go.
Yeah, it's amazing. So I'm imagining you now as a director with some like, give me more of that. So let's circle back to you serving your clients, right, and storytelling. And in the introduction, you talked about how you didn't like the commercial part of it because it felt fake. Um, and so when somebody, if I were to hire you as a ghostwriter, that might be a concern too, is that there's that balance between the image we want to portray professionally, right? Or even just what we're comfortable of portraying. And then there's the true authentic self and everything in between, right? But I want you to share the importance or the value for maybe someone who's not so comfortable telling the real version or the real story of themselves. I feel like sometimes in business we put on, or like social media is a perfect example. You have to, or dating, you put your younger, skinnier, more perfect version
Less
out
gray hair.
less gray hair. Now, my formula for catching my husband is I showed him the worst. Like I did the opposite of marketing. I thought I have to exceed expectations. So let's share him like dirty under my fingernails, sweaty, whatever. So talk to me about the best stories and what makes it really great if somebody can be, I'm guessing you want them to be vulnerable and raw and true. How
Very much so.
how
Yeah.
does that pay off for them? Like convince us.
So the thing about authenticity, which is one of my favorite words, is
Mhm.
your ability to be vulnerable and just say, okay, here's what it is. And the worst sort of biographies and stuff like that are the ones that are glossy, are the ones that everything worked out. Because that's not reality, and we know that's not reality. And so I always work with people and I try very hard to get them to understand the value of that authenticity and just say, we're going to share the good, the bad, and the ugly. And we're going to be very honest about it. Because if we don't talk about our mistakes, then people are going to make those same mistakes. But they can learn from our mistakes if we're willing to talk about it. And so that's one of the things that I do with my clients on the ghostwriting side is that I say, okay, this isn't we're not just telling your story. We're telling your story as a tool to serve other people about what it is that you've learned and how it's affected your business and how it's affected your personal life. And some of that means you're going to have to talk about when you fell flat on your face. And you have to be able to authentically do that. And most of the time, even with people who are a little bit more closed off that I've worked with, it's a very cathartic thing for them to be able to get into a place where we're talking and where we're on Zoom and interviewing and it's all being recorded and they're able to just say what they're actually thinking and actually feeling and the actual reality of what happened when they passed through things. Because I think that we don't want to remember those things sometimes because of the fact that, oh, we're in a safe place now and I don't need to worry about it. But there's something to be said about revisiting those things from a safe place when you know that that experience didn't kill you. And it really helps people to understand the impact of that and how big of a thing it actually was. And when
Mhm.
they understand that, they take so much more pride in where they are because they realize, wow, that really was hard. That was not a great experience, and I really messed up. But now look at where I am. And so people generally are quite open once they understand the purpose behind it. And I have never had someone who's like, well, I don't want. I mean, I've had some people who are like, for legal purposes, we can't put this in, so we need to change it. And that's totally understandable. That's understandable.
Don't use someone's name or
Yeah, yeah, and that's fine. But when it comes to their own personal, defeats, that is amazing. It's an amazing experience. And I've never had anyone at the end be like, wow, I wish I hadn't said that. They're always like, thank you so much for giving me a safe space to talk about that. And I'm really glad that I'm able to share it with people now because I think that they're going to be able to avoid this, this, and this. So yeah, for me, authenticity is the number one thing. And when people are authentic, it changes their lives.
yeah, amazing. And so how do they so I apologize because I'm so inspired
No,
talking. I
you're
have so
good.
many ideas. I just my they're turning and I know we're limited on time, but a lot of business, I'm going to say mistakes, even though there's really no true mistake, is I think that getting stuck in, I need the revenue to come in, right? You've talked about that. Um, And it would be nice if that wasn't a concern and we could just express our gift and be that for the world. But how do you monetize telling your story? Like, what is the return on investment of working with you and telling your story in these different fields? Like, if somebody asks me about writing a book, I usually tell them don't do it for the money. I'm curious if you have some of the same opinions. And
Very much so. The first thing I do is when I sit down with people, I'm like, okay, we need to have the purpose behind why you want this book.
hmm,
And if it's just to become a millionaire author, well, then that is not going to happen. I mean, it can in some like minuscule, but it's not. I always am very honest. I'm like, there's too many authors and you're not well known enough. And yeah, if you're, hugely famous, okay, you can make some money off of it. But if you have another purpose, like for a lot of people, it's to serve their business and their brand, to make it so that they're the expert in their field, to make it so that, if they're getting into public speaking, that's kind of the
is that,
entry
you think
point.
that's most common? People want to write a book to be an expert
A lot of times that is, but most of the
or
time it is to
calling
serve
card
their business,
use.
is that they have a really great story. They're very
Mhm.
proud of it, or they're like, I know that this can help my business. I've had some where, like in one case, I worked with a client who he was the founder of the company. Him personally was the brand of the company. And this at this point was a $2 billion company. And he was like, if I were to step away from it tomorrow, we would lose most of our clients because I'm the point. So we wrote his book as the founder's story, going through all of his mistakes and all of that stuff, being very honest, so that it could be used as a sales tool so that they could always say, this is his story, this is how we do business, and this is how we will always do business, which then allowed him to step back. And suddenly the brand
Super cool.
outlived him. And he could start now giving it to other people because it existed. So as long as someone has a purpose, whether it's and if the purpose has something about helping other people through their story, it will always work. Especially with business. If you're using it in a business setting, it's an investment, yes, but it always, in my experience, it has always paid big dividends because they're able to use it in so many ways. And I've had people where it's been very personal and they're like, I want to do this to just get this story out there and to help other people. And they've used it to parlay into speaking careers and things like that. But the purpose is the most important thing. If you have a purpose as to why you want this story out there, then it's going to work. But if you want it just to make a whole bunch of money, well, that is not going to work.
I love it because I feel like that not even just specifically with the services that you offer, but that comes into play with business too. Is that when we're focusing on the money, I always like to ask people, would you expect them to throw money at you because you want to make a lot of money? No, but if you have a purpose that's a contribution to them and you're solving a problem for them or you're making their life better, then they want to give you money for that. So I loved that same thing as, when you have an overall intention behind the work you do, that's amazing. So before we run out of the time, is there a question that I should have asked you? Like,
I don't know. We covered so much,
like if you
so
had your
much stuff.
biggest gift to give away, because that's ultimately what I want is I know we have to live through experiences, but I feel like if I could hand it to somebody on a silver platter, what have you learned that would be just an amazing lesson for someone?
Oh God, I think it would be to take pride in your story, to understand that your story is about every experience you've had and everything you've done and every place you've been. And it is the sum total of where you are right now. And so if you can take pride in your story and look and say, wow, I've been through a lot of stuff and I've made some good decisions and I made some bad decisions, but it's made me who I am at this moment. It gives you a better understanding of who you are right now. And I think it just makes you love yourself a little bit more, which is important to appreciate yourself and go
Mhm.
like, I've screwed up a whole bunch. I've made tons of mistakes, but I'm using those mistakes in order to build something better, build a better person at the very least. And if you do that, it really changes your perspective on yourself. And I think it makes you more likely to share your story, to share the things you've been through in order to help other people so that they can learn from your mistakes and potentially not make them themselves. They'll make all new ones. They'll find new ways to screw up. We all do. But you'll be able to help them so that they can avoid some of those. And I think that that's very fulfilling and makes us all feel just much better about themselves. So that's what I would say.
Amazing. So you kind of answered my last question for you, and for talking from my own self-doubt, right? Talk about being a real person is one of my limiting beliefs is that too, that people don't really care about me. Like, do they want to hear my story? And someone else is already doing it and doing a better job, so I don't need to share mine. Do you have just the truth, just the
No,
truth.
that's that, and that's
And they
really
dominate
common.
my world,
Yeah.
right? In the background, most days I don't know that. So what would you say? How would you respond to that? Like, you know, everybody wants to be famous. I think that humans want to be seen and heard. I related to being cathartic and being able to tell your story, but do people really want to hear my story?
They do. They do because we connect with each other through story. We don't connect through, that's why, like, when you're in a networking situation or something, you never want to say, well, this is what I do, and that's it. You want to say, this is why I do what I do. And generally, it has something to do with your story. People want to hear it. They want to connect with you. They want to understand who you are. And so when you share it, suddenly you're not just an associate, you're a friend. And then that invites them to do the same. And you then learn amazing things about them where you're just like, oh my gosh, I did not know that you did this, this, and this in your past. And it becomes that sort of share moment between two people. So yes, everyone wants to hear it. And the thing about like doing a book or doing something like that, where it's like, okay, yeah, you're not likely to have billions of people be like, oh, look, there's Cinnamon, woo. But you're going to have impact on that group of people around you, and it's going to be bigger because of it. And that group of people you can have impact on. It's like when we try and do good in the world, most of us do not have the means or the platform to be able to do good for millions of people. But we do have the means to do good for all the people that we run into. And that's a much smaller group, but that impact is no less. You're no less important. The acts that you do are, they're not lesser because they're not helping 20 million people.
Right.
And it's the same thing with the story. Yeah, it's not gonna, you're not Taylor Swift, there's not tens and hundreds of millions of people who love you, but you can make impact all the same in your sphere. And
Yeah.
that has value.
I like to think of it as like not everybody likes the same flavor because my name's Cinnamon.
Yes.
Right. It's
Yes.
okay. You could like cinnamon or not like cinnamon, vanilla, chocolate. And for you, it's like everybody has a different superpower.
Yes.
Right. So I can't thank you enough for doing this for me. And for our listeners, if you can tell them there are multiple places where they can find you.
Yes.
Super
So
Heumann
if
Creative.
check out superhuman.com, spelled like my last name. So super, super, HEUMANN.com. You can also check out stephenhumanauthor.com. That's my website. I have stephenhuman.com as well, but it's actually just connected right now and I have to fix that. So, so go to
Just
Stephen Human
redirect it so it
Author.
goes somewhere else.
It would all go to the same website. I just realized that I had screwed up the connection like 2 weeks ago and just found out about it a couple days ago. So I'm Stephen Human Author. And then I'm on Facebook and all that stuff,
LinkedIn.
LinkedIn, and you can find me. So it's HEUMANN. But feel free to reach out. And if you just want to talk about story and see what it would take or if you want to write your own and you just want a couple tips, I'm more than happy to give you a few tips on how to make it easier for you to write your own story. So you don't have to go through me or anybody else. You can be the author of your own tale. And so I'm more than happy to kind of give those insights and few tips that make it easier.
And you contributed some tips. Anybody who's following us on worldchangemaker.com. Also, you contributed an article on our blog. And if you enjoyed having this conversation with us, to all of our listeners, please like and follow us and recommend World Changemaker podcast to a friend. So thanks again, Stephen. It was really, really a pleasure.
Thank you, Cinnamon. This has been wonderful.